Thanks very much, Andy. So good morning, my brothers and sisters and young people, especially the young people who need to listen out for 4 quotes for their worksheet. So don't worry, I'll let you know when they're coming along, but there are 4 quotes. So my theme today is around growth and strength and shelter. We shall enter the temple of God. We shall plant a couple of trees, and we shall visit the Garden of Gethsemane together. Have you ever been in one of those rather incredible rooms which are completely lined by wood panels? There are modern versions of these rooms, or even whole houses, lined with light-coloured beech or ash or elm or pine. Beautiful, light, honey yellows flow with the smooth milk chocolate rain running the full height of the walls and across the vaulted ceilings. Natural and textured and warm and reassuring. I cannot help but reach out and run my fingers across the panels, following the grain, feeling the fingerprint of the wood. I cannot help but pause as I take in the texture and the light pine aroma. Complemented by the warmth of sunlight, the wood appears alive, and as the light caresses the wood, it seems to breathe. And I am inside a living building. I am inside a great pine in the southern wilderness of Tasmania. And of course, there are the more stately, deeper, richer rooms lined with cedar or walnut or mahogany. Panels perfectly slotted together next to each other. Carvings of important people or events or things of beauty over the lintels, across the pillars and in the visually captivating parts of the room. The wood is more at home in the evening sunlight or in the shadows of a flickering candle than it is in the noontime sun through a skylight. The depth of colour is perfectly matched by the silken smoothness of the polish. And I am mesmerised by the candlelight dancing across the cedar. I breathe the aroma like an aged red wine, and my mind is instantly calmed. My breathing slows, and I feel comfort and strength in the walls. I'm inside a great cedar of Lebanon. I am inside the living temple of our living God. The cedars of Lebanon were widely regarded as the most beautiful, the strongest, the tallest, the most magnificent trees in the region. And there's powerful symbolism surrounding those great trees that gave Lebanon its ancient mystique. And even today, the cedar features prominently and proudly on the Lebanese flag. The great cedar is specifically mentioned as an example of the wisdom of Solomon. Let's remind ourselves of the wisdom of Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 4. And all of my readings today are from the ESV. 1 Kings 4, verse 29. And God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, and breadth of mind like the sand on the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. And here's the first quote for the young people, verse 32. He also spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. In Solomon's day, the king of Lebanon was Hiram, a close friend to both David and to Solomon, and a powerful ally. In fact, a partner in the service of God. Hiram gladly worked with Solomon to provide cedars to build the temple of God. His people worked side by side with the Israelis to create a building which grew as quietly as the cedar. 1 Kings 6, verse 7. When the house was built, it was built with stone prepared at the quarry, so that neither hammer or axe or any tool of iron was heard in the house while it was being built. The temple was purposely designed from its foundations to be a place of quiet meditation, a place to reach out to God and for God to reach back to us in peace. A building designed to grow out of the soil in silence, like a growing tree. And when you're inside, there's no hint of it being a house made of stone. This building was not a monument to earth and rocks that people could walk over. Like the process of building, being in this house was the same as being inside one of the great cedars of Lebanon. 1 Kings 6, verse 14. So Solomon built the house and finished it. He lined the walls of the house on the inside with boards of cedar. From the floor of the house to the walls of the ceiling, he covered the inside with wood. And in verse 18, the cedar within the house was carved in the form of gourds and open flowers. All was cedar. No stone was seen. Being in the temple was like being in a great cedar of Lebanon. No wonder the psalmist picked up this concept in our reading today. And for those listening at home, this is quote number 2. Psalm 92, verse 12. The righteous flourish like the palm tree and grow like the cedar in Lebanon. They are planted in the house of the Lord. Planted in the house of the Lord. They flourish in the courts of our God. Because our faith is one of peaceful meditation. Our faith is one of camaraderie in the building. Our faith grows from the earth and rocks into a living thing of beauty and strength. Our faith is about working with others like Solomon and Hiram did, despite any differences. Remember, Hiram wasn't even an Israeli. He was not a Jew. He was not descended from Abraham. He was not a natural heir of the promises. Hiram was Lebanese. And these two men, these two people were bound together. Back in 1 Kings, chapter 5. Verse 12. And the Lord gave Solomon wisdom, and he promised him. As he promised him. And there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty. We're not told what the treaty entailed. Maybe this passage just prosaically refers to the trade treaty outlined in the preceding verses. And we're also not told what symbolised the treaty. Was it a signed document or parchment? Or was it something more poetic and relevant to the activity of building the temple? Did they plant a cedar to represent the strength and longevity of their treaty and their friendship? And I think the psalmist in Psalm 92 suggests that that was the case. The righteous grow like the cedar in Lebanon. They are planted in the house of the Lord. So, and this certainly would not have been the first time a great man of God planted a tree to represent an alliance. Let's take a quick look at Abraham and Abimelech, the Philistine, in Genesis chapter 21. This part of the story of Abraham and Abimelech starts with a really strong statement of faith from Abimelech and his general Phicol. Genesis 21, verse 22. At that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, "God is with you in all that you do." Such a strong statement of faith. And later in the story, Abraham and Abimelech resolve quite a tense dispute over water at a place now known as Beersheba. And they swore an oath together. This oath, this treaty, this covenant bound these two men of faith. And this is the third of the quotes. Genesis 21, verse 32. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. The tamarisk tree is an altogether different tree from the magnificent cedar of Lebanon. The cedar is towering in its might. Most tamarisks are a bit bigger than a shrub. The cedar forms forests that cover hills with green, bringing shade and life into an ever-changing and vibrant forest. The tamarisk can eke out its existence in the harshest of situations. It's most at home along a waterway, where in our country it can become quite a pest. But it's hardy, a bit spindly, and it can survive. The cedar is the temple of God. The tamarisk, well, you'd never use it to build anything, really. But here we see Abraham plants a tamarisk. When I think of planting a tree, I kind of think of my weekly pilgrimage to Bunnings or my favourite garden shop to browse over beautiful, healthy foliage and pick out something that looks nice. It's really quite easy. You know, before Bunnings, people had to go to the bush and collect the seed at the exact right time of the year. And then they had to grow the plants from that seed in some sort of potting mix that they made themselves from compost, which they made from food scraps. Or they'd take cuttings of trees at the right time and care for those cuttings for a long time. And finally, after some months and months of planning and work, they would possibly have something that would be worthy of the name tree to plant. So Abraham planting a tamarisk tree wasn't just a Saturday afternoon hobby. And despite the obvious problem with the tamarisk, mainly that it's not a cedar, it was actually the perfect tree for the location. Something that would slowly grow over generations and generations. A tree that could just survive pretty much anywhere and form the start of an oasis in a really remote place. A tree for shade and cool and shelter and protection. Quite different roles from the cedar, but just as useful and just as important. And most importantly, the tamarisk represented the alliance of faithful people and the presence of God in their relationship. A relationship between a Jewish man of faith and a faithful Philistine. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And the tamarisk was starting something everlasting. So we're kind of developing a certain theme around trees. The cedar and the tamarisk, because they are living and growing and useful, are symbols of alliances and friendships and a family bonding love with God at the centre. This is our faith. We are growing and strong temples of cedar and sheltering tamarisks in the desert. So trees in a forest can usually look after themselves pretty well. Trees grown for a purpose usually need a lot of attention and care. The olive, to produce the largest amount of that most delicious fruit, they need to be pruned and fertilised and watered. The grapevine needs to be in the right position and trained to grow along those guide wires. The fig tree needs to be protected from birds. Jesus recognised when a fruit tree needed to perform. Let's turn to Mark chapter 11. Mark chapter 11 is a chapter all about authority, the authority of Jesus. We find at the start of Mark chapter 11, Jesus receiving the welcome of a king. We find him overturning the tables of the unscrupulous currency traders in the temple. We find him in authority. And in verse 12, we read, "On the following day, when they, Jesus and his disciples, came from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it wasn't the season for figs. And he said to it, 'May no one ever eat fruit from you again.' And his disciples heard that." And we know what happened. You can read about it a bit further in Mark. That tree shriveled up and died. A fruit tree that does not produce fruit when that fruit is needed is just not useful. Let's not be that tree. So, just a little diversion, kind of related. Some evenings, I give my little bonsai trees some attention. I may have been thinking about the changes for weeks, planning the direction of a branch, the angle of a trunk. So I gently remove a little banksia from its pot, and I scrape off all the dirt from around its roots, deep, strong roots and fine little rootlets cascading under the tree. They will have to fit in their new pot, their beautiful new home filled with a special clay and potting mix and fertiliser and some decorative rocks. A place where those trimmed and perfect roots can grow and spread and make sure the branches above the surface can grow and reach the sky. After pressing in the good soil, I choose which branches to stay and which branches to go. Making a bonsai is a bit like making a living sculpture. Some branches are heading completely in the wrong direction, and I have to cut them off. I keep some of the stumps to remind me never to grow in that direction again. I see the potential in some other branches of mine, and I choose to redirect them a bit. Wire is placed around my branches to push them into the right shape and grow in the right direction. The wire stops me from bouncing back to the wrong direction, and after some time my branches will set. My old ways would have been cut off and new directions set. I shall now have to constantly watch out for new buds and branches which may be growing in the wrong direction. And with the help of my carer, the great master gardener, I can stay as a beautiful little tree, slowly growing and being open to trimming and shaping over the years. I can be the banksia bonsai and let God trim and guide me. But there can be a sinister side to trees too. Back in Genesis 21, just before the story of the treaty of the newly planted tamarisk tree, we find Hagar and Ishmael in the same chapter, banished from Abraham's camp and on the brink of death from thirst in the same wilderness of Beersheba. Genesis 21, verse 15. When the water skin was gone, she, Hagar, put the child under one of the bushes, and she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bowshot. For she said, "Let me not look upon the death of the child." The unidentified bush, you can imagine it, with spindly, scraggy little tentacles of branches, was the symbol of death of Ishmael. This scratchy, spindly thing that gave just enough shade to comfort the child while he died. But we know what happened. God opened Hagar's eyes to a little well of water, and even in their deepest despair and at their darkest hour, God did not leave them. That scratchy little bush, which was all about death, was changed to a symbol of life. Living water plus the shade of that bush saved the lives of Hagar and her child Ishmael. And so it is with our Saviour. A couple of roughly cut wooden planks nailed together in the shape of a cross represented certain death for Jesus. Dead wood thrown on the back of Jesus to carry to his certain death. It offered no shade. There was no living water. The trees were no longer growing. All was death. But Jesus turned around this scene of death, and the cross has become an enduring sign of optimism and life to his believers for hundreds of years. We share the bread and wine of Jesus' Last Supper as a reminder of his death and the life that it can bring to each one of us. And while Jesus conquered sin and death on the cross by himself, there were supporters in those final hours. And also the fourth and final quote, Luke 23, verse 26. And as they led him away, they seized one Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and laid the cross on him to carry it behind Jesus. And there followed him a great multitude of people and of women who were mourning and lamenting him. Poor old Simon of Cyrene, a foreigner with really bad timing. Forced to carry the cross. Presumably he was there by himself, making him an easy target for the crowd to force him to do such a horrible job. Maybe he was coming to the big city with hope in his heart for the opportunities it held. Maybe he was looking for a new life and a new direction to grow. Well, I don't think he could have ever predicted that he would be carrying the cross of the Son of God and starting a remarkable new direction in his life. But our focus right now isn't on Simon, it's on Jesus. Jesus, helped by a stranger, lamented by the people, not really the support he would have chosen, but it was probably the support he needed. Physical help from Simon, and a reflection of his emotions by the crowd. We know that just a couple of hours earlier, Jesus had significantly more support. Jesus was at the foot of the Mount of Olives in a beautiful garden of Gethsemane with his disciples, surrounded by beautiful living sculptures of manicured, fruiting olive trees. Jesus took with him the rather sleep-deprived Peter and James and John, and while the disciples slept, Jesus prayed and cried and was comforted by an angel. Jesus at that time was surrounded by life. His disciples representing a willingness to follow, but the difficulty of getting things right. The angel, the divine support we don't often know that we even need. And his tears like blood, the open outpouring of emotions which can be cathartic, but can also open up new beginnings. And the garden, the cool humidity under a canopy of green, the soft light filtered which breezes through the leaves of the trees, the purposefully pruned direction and size and shape of the branches, the robust trunk, which means the tree will never move, the roots appearing from the earth to make the whole tree thrive. Jesus was surrounded by life. Olive trees, decades or century or even millennia old, the closest thing we have to everlasting life on our planet, the olive tree. Jesus was surrounded by the support of everlasting life, of foundations, of growth, of strength, of light, of purpose, and of beauty. The complete opposite of the cross which was soon to come. The garden sheltered him. It was the last phase of the growth of Jesus, the last thing to do and to experience before the trial. As part of the garden, he had the strength he needed to face that dead wood of the cross and triumph. So right now we're about to meditate and reflect on the life of our Lord, our Saviour, and our friend Jesus. We are about to join him in the garden with those other ancient olive trees. We are to consider our life inside the Cedar temple of God. We are the manicured bonsai, and we will contemplate the direction of our branches. We are the productive fruit tree cared for by God. Through this bread and this wine, we have an everlasting treaty with our God, and it is all under the protection of a tamarisk tree in the wilderness.